Hello and welcome. Today, we are going to pull apart a really powerful social force, one that honestly shapes everything from our big institutions right down to how we think about ourselves. And that's stigma. So let's just jump right in and figure out how it works and, maybe more importantly, what we can do about it. It all really starts with a question, just like this one from Reddit. It's so simple, so direct, and just so incredibly human. And it's a great question, right? Why is there this huge gap between something pretty much everyone goes through and the social penalty that can come with it? This is the core puzzle we're going to try to unpack together. So before we can even start talking about fixing things, we've got to get on the same page about what stigma actually is, because it's so much more than just a nasty comment or, a bad vibe. It's a whole structured social process. Okay, so at its heart, this is what we're talking about. Stigma takes one single thing about a person, could be a health condition, who they are, where they're from, and uses it to mark them as different. Then that label gets tangled up with all these negative stereotypes, which then makes it seem okay to deny that person the basic social acceptance everyone else just gets. It's an active process, not just a static label. And this brings us to a really powerful idea called the stigma tax. Think of it like malware running in the background on your computer. It's this constant, low-level hum of managing how other people see you, trying to predict their judgment, and just navigating a world that wasn't really built with you in mind. All of that just eats up your mental energy, your cognitive bandwidth, that you could be using for, your job, or learning, or just connecting with people you love. So how does this actually happen? Well, it pretty much unfolds in 4 predictable steps. First, a difference gets labeled. Then, all these cultural ideas link that label to negative stereotypes. Step 3, the labeled group gets shoved into its own separate box, which creates this us versus them mentality. And finally, that division leads to real-world discrimination and a loss of status. It's a blueprint. All right, let's zoom out a bit and see how this thing scales up from just individual prejudice to something way, way bigger. This is where we can start to see stigma not as just random acts of meanness, but as a predictable, almost mechanical system that is designed to create exclusion. And this is such a fascinating way to reframe the problem. What if we looked at institutional stigma like it was a faulty machine? We could analyze it like an engineer would. We could pinpoint exactly where the system is breaking down, what they call its failure modes, and then we could design specific fixes or controls to make it right. And this slide just illustrates that perfectly. Take this case study, the credential black box. The scenario is, a newcomer submits their professional qualifications, but the whole evaluation process is a complete mystery. The failure mode here is that the system's lack of clarity, its opacity, turns a simple procedure into a source of chronic stress. So what's the fix? Well, you publish clear rules, you set standard timelines, you give people useful feedback. See? It's a systems fix for a systems problem. Because the human cost of a system like that is just huge. It's that nightmarish, Kafkaesque feeling of being judged by rules you can't see and a process you can't possibly understand. It's this feeling of total powerlessness, and that is a hallmark of systemic stigma. Okay, so knowing what we're up against, what has society actually done to fight back? Well, this brings us to all those massive efforts to change hearts and minds, through public campaigns and the media. And there have been a ton of different approaches. We've seen the big, glossy ad campaigns, community education programs, and really powerful protest movements that led to actual laws being changed, like the Americans with Disabilities Act amendments. And now we've got online services and grassroots campaigns all trying to tackle the same problem. But here's where it gets really, really surprising. A huge Canadian study called Opening Minds dug deep into what actually works. And what they found was pretty stark. Those big, expensive mass media campaigns, turns out they were not effective at actually changing people's attitudes. So what did work? Contact-based education. Real people sharing their real stories, face to face. Let that sink in for a second. This quote from the Mental Health Commission of Canada is a total game changer. It forces us to question everything we thought we knew about changing public perception. Apparently, just broadcasting a message out into the world isn't enough to break through really deep-seated stigma. And of course, that brings us right to the modern battlefield, social media. It's the ultimate double-edged sword, isn't it? On the one hand, platforms like TikTok give people a megaphone to share their authentic stories. But on the other hand, those same platforms can be breeding grounds for misinformation and cyberbullying that can make stigma even worse. So, if the big media campaigns aren't really the answer, let's focus on what is. The research points to one single strategy that is the most effective tool we have, and it might not be what you think. So, let's just ask the question directly. After all this time, all this money, and all this research, what's the one thing that truly moves the needle on stigma? One word: contact. It's direct, meaningful interaction between people. I know, it sounds almost too simple to be true, but the evidence is just overwhelming. So, why is contact so powerful? Well, stigma thrives in the abstract, right? It feeds on our fear of the unknown. But when you have a real, positive interaction with someone, the stereotype in your head gets replaced by an actual human being. That whole us versus them barrier just crumbles. And what's incredible is that it not only reduces public stigma in others, but it can also reduce self-stigma by empowering the person who's sharing their story. And the proof for this is rock solid. You can look at decades of research on both HIV-related stigma and mental illness, and the pattern is exactly the same. Social rejection and isolation always lead to worse health outcomes. People avoid getting tested, they stop taking their medication, but the moment you create chances for real connection and support, their health improves. It's a direct link. And this brings us to our final and maybe our most important section. We've talked about systems and society, but what happens when that external force of stigma actually gets inside our own heads? What happens when we start to believe the stereotypes about ourselves? This is what we call self-stigma. It's that moment when the stigma tax stops being an external pressure and becomes an internal belief. It's when a person hears all those negative messages from society, absorbs them, and starts to think they're true about themselves. And this doesn't just happen all at once. It's a process. It starts with just being aware of the stereotype. You know what people say. But then it can move to agreement, where you start to think, yeah, maybe they're right. And the final, most damaging stage is when you apply it to yourself. When you think, that's not just a stereotype, that's actually me. And the consequence of this is just absolutely devastating. Researchers have a heartbreaking name for it. They call it the why try effect. Because if you believe the negative stereotypes, that you're incompetent or that you can't recover, then why would you even try? It just crushes your self-esteem and becomes one of the single biggest barriers to getting help and getting better. So we end up right back where we started, but with a much sharper question. The evidence is clear. Real human contact is the most powerful antidote we have to stigma. But in a world that is more and more digital, more remote, and in a lot of ways more isolated than ever before, how do we create the kind of meaningful contact that actually changes minds and saves lives? And that, I think, is the challenge for all of us.